History is pretty daft. And when it comes to the history of popes, there are many weird moments to choose from. However, it's harder to find a weirder moment than when the murder of a French sailor leads to 3 men all claiming to be the one true pope at the exact same time a century later. Meet a bunch of Norman sailors ruled by the French, and a bunch of Béarnais sailors from a different region of France, but that are actually controlled by England at this time. We are currently on the island of Cumanon in 1292, and these sailors arguing over the most important thing in the world. Who's allowed to get water out of a well first? Eventually, they find a way to settle the argument, by stabbing each other. It's hard to know who killed who first, but outrage from the fight quickly spread. Soon, English and French ships, who were always looking for some reason to fight each other, had a just cause to ram and kill as many as possible. In no time at all, the fighting spread and boiled over into outright war called the Gascon War. Enter our first character on a road to papal chaos, Philip IV. At the time, Philip IV was also called Philip the Fair, which in modern terms roughly translates to Philip the Absolute Hottie. But Philip had a problem that even good looks couldn't save him from. Wars were expensive, and Philip desperately needed cash if he wanted to beat the English in the Gascon War. It was then he realised that his kingdom contained an organisation filled with luxurious stone houses, incredibly wealthy individuals, and countless amounts of gold and gems. This organisation? The Catholic Church. Now, it may surprise you to learn that the French Catholic Church was surprisingly on board with the idea of being taxed, and had even agreed to give a whole fifth of their wealth away. It just goes to show that even men devoted to peace were still willing to give money to beat up the English. There was just one person who wasn't. The Pope. Pope Boniface VIII, and who of course had final say. He argued to give away money threatened the power and authority of the church. And we can't be having that, because after all, the church represented God himself. However, it might be more accurate to say that Boniface feared the decline of his own power over anything else, as despite being pope, Boniface was no saint. For example, after an argument with one of his cardinals led to 2 cities and several towns revolting against Boniface, Boniface promised he would spare the towns if they would let his soldiers in peacefully. The rebels agreed, and Boniface's forces quickly took over, and were then ordered to burn the city to the ground and literally sow salt into the earth so nothing could grow. As a result, the most famous depiction of Boniface can be found in Dante's Divine Comedy, where he rots in the 8th circle of hell. In short, one thing you need to quickly learn about this story is that sadly there are no heroes, just some villains who are more evil than others. Philip and Boniface continued to clash over taxation and power for several years, and Philip even started banning French bishops from going back to Rome. This was a bridge too far. It can mean that French bishops were being separated from papal Roman control, and it can mean that Boniface could lose control of the entire church in France. As a result, in November 1302, Boniface signed the Unam Sanctum. This was a papal bull, which is a fancy way of saying an important pope decree, saying that the pope was, and always will be, the single most important power in Europe, even more important than a king, including King Philip, no matter how hot he was. When even that doesn't settle the argument, Boniface pushes things to the ultimate level and excommunicates Philip. This means that Philip was banned from the Catholic Church, and by extension, Philip would not be able to have his sins forgiven or be able to get to heaven. In short, Philip was now barred from paradise until he made amends with the Pope. Philip may be known as Philip the Fair, but he wasn't known as Philip the Patient, and he immediately decides the only way he can stop this is to literally attack the Pope. Philip then gathered up an army and sent it to attack Boniface directly, besieging his papal palace in Agani, breaking in, famously slapping him and beating him up to a pulp before nearly executing him, then deciding that's probably a bit too far and then letting him go. Boniface was able to escape but quickly dies of his wounds. Back in Rome, the bishops and cardinals, those who were second in power only to the Pope, started to get a bit panicky. The Vatican in Rome needed a new pope, but they needed to try and elect one who wasn't going to make things even worse with France. They therefore decided to elect a pope a bit more French-friendly to cool things down a bit. Enter Benedict XI, a cool dude who, after being elected in 1303, pardons Francis of that whole excommunication business and then promptly dies. Quick side note, it's important to note that popes, when they're elected, they're usually pretty old. As a result, you're going to notice a nasty habit of popes being elected, then promptly dying after doing basically anything important. The Vatican now needs yet another pope, but this time the election is going to be a lot harder to do. Half the cardinals in the Vatican are French, and therefore, funnily enough, want a French pope. But the other majority are Roman, and they don't want a French pope, they want a Roman pope. As a result, the two groups are left bickering with each other for months on end, with neither side able to make a compromise. After 11 months without a pope and constant deliberation and discussion, they eventually choose to elect Clement V in 1305. He just so happens to be pretty good friends with Philip and wasn't even a cardinal first. Funny that. I'm sure no self-respecting monarch would in any way try and interfere or bribe someone in a papal election. I mean, after all, that would be a major sin. However, upon donning the papal tiara, Clement V suddenly realised he wasn't all that popular in Rome, especially with the Roman cardinals, and this, combined with lots of infighting in the city itself, eventually led him to saying, "Sod it." Clement V realises the only way to escape the arguments was to leave Rome entirely. As a result, Clement V decides to take the papal seat and move it to Avignon, France, which just so happens to be ruled by his old buddy Philip IV. The papacy had now formally been moved from Rome to France, leading to a period known as the Avignon Papacy, and for the next 68 years the popes would all live in Avignon. However, although they were a pope, it's probably more accurate to describe them more like a prince or a king, as they were far more concerned with material wealth than spiritual wealth. For example, they lived in the massive Palais des Papes, the Palace of Popes, and held huge feasts like Clement VI's massive banquet of 9 courses, each made up of 3 dishes, with the finale being a giant castle filled with cooked animals that were shaped to look like they were still alive. And although the popes may have enjoyed this new lovely lifestyle, the rest of Europe was less impressed. They accuse these new popes of being like the ancient city of Babylon, a metaphor for sin and vice. Eventually, a new pope, Gregory XI, decides enough is enough and heads back from Avignon to Rome in 1377 before taking part in the noblest of papal traditions and promptly dying in 1378. This means it's time for yet another papal election! Woohoo! This time, the people of Rome were determined to elect a Roman pope and make sure it doesn't go back to France, and so they decide to riot. The mob attacked the Vatican directly, surrounding the papal conclave where the election was taking place, and even supposedly smashing their way into the Vatican's wine cellar and having a nice drink while they were at it. Under pressure from the mob, the conclave had to choose quickly. They decided to choose Pope Urban VI. This decision, however, was made entirely to try and save their own hide. No one particularly liked Urban all that much. He wasn't even a cardinal. The plan was simply to elect someone, then leave Rome as quickly as possible before anyone could figure out who was actually in charge. This was doubly true as Urban wasn't even Roman. He was from Napoli in the south of Italy. Worst of all, Urban was a bit of a reformer and decided he should call a ban on all monetary and valuable gifts given to church members by people outside of a church. On paper, this would make them closer to Jesus and try and live free of worldly temptation. But this would mean that the bishops would lose a major source of income. And the bishops rather liked their worldly temptations, thank you very much, and so immediately opposed Urban. As a result, in 1378, mere months after Urban was elected Pope himself, French cardinals began to plot and conspire to put a French cardinal on the papal throne. The only problem was, the papal throne in Italy was currently sat on by Urban. They needed a different throne to stick their pope on. But why not the one in Avignon? Therefore, the French cardinals got together and declared that Pope Urban wasn't actually the real pope, but he was a pope they had to choose by force due to the Roman mob. Instead, Pope Clement VII, one of our own, was the real Pope, and he would be based back in France yet again. Pope Clement even accused Pope Urban of being the Antichrist, the opposite of Jesus who would plunge the world into darkness. This meant Europe now had two popes, Pope Clement VII in France and the original Pope Urban VI based in Rome. Different countries would also start siding with different popes and even using their belief on who was the true rightful representative of the all-loving God to stab one another. Europe had now been plunged into chaos, and this chaos became known as the Western Schism. Yet, sadly, this video is getting a touch long, and we still have a third pope to introduce, so we'll need to end things there. Yet stay tuned for next time when we discover how a man with a fuzzy hat will end the Western Schism. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to see even more utterly bizarre moments from history poorly animated by me, then be bold and click that proud red subscribe button just below this video. Go on. Do it. It's there, waiting for you. Greatness is mere moments away. And while you're at it, why don't you click that little bell next to it? Then you'll actually know when I make a video. Why?